the start, it's Fangio in front, and Ascari right behind him.
There was a time when you could see a racing driver at work. There was a time when you could get close to the action. There was a time before safety barriers when going off the track could mean going into the trees. And there was a time when Grand Prix drivers raced at the Nurburgring. Nurburgring in the Eifel Mountains of Germany holds a special place in motor racing history. Alongside Indianapolis and Le Mans, it provides the classic test of man and machine. In the 50s, the stars of the day like Fangio, Farina, Ascari, Moss and Hawthorne did battle over its 14-mile length. And in this German Grand Prix from 40 years ago, 1953, 100,000 came to watch, despite the problems. Like a lap time of around 10 minutes, so a long wait before the leaders came round again. Like the confusion of drivers swapping cars, as when world champion Ascari takes over teammate Villarese's Ferrari. The risks were great, the courage enormous. Before swapping cars, Ascari had lost the front wheel at over 140 miles an hour. Such speeds are impressive even now. Imagine averaging 85 miles an hour in that open cockpit, with no seatbelt, no protective clothing, and a minimal crash helmet. In 1953, Farina came home first for Ferrari, their fourth successive win at the ring. They weren't so fortunate in 1976. Niki Lauda's Ferrari inexplicably left the road on a slight left-hand bend, and the consequences were horrific. Lauda survived through the bravery of fellow racing drivers, but he suffered terrible burns. It highlighted the difficulty of quickly getting medical help to an injured driver anywhere around a 14-mile circuit, and there was no simple solution. Well, since that accident that happened just half a mile up the road from this famous Adenauer Bridge corner, the Grand Prix cars have never returned to the old Nürburgring circuit. But far from falling into decline, the track is now busier than ever. For just £5 a lap, you can take any car or motorcycle you like round the Nürburgring and discover why the Grand Prix circus left. Apart from the safety question, there was the growing importance of television coverage, and with some 150 corners, doing a decent outside broadcast would make televising a conventional Grand Prix look about as difficult as covering indoor bowls. The original circuit opened in 1927 with a north loop of 14 miles and a south loop of nearly 5, although only the north loop was used after 1931. It's so big that there are 4 small villages inside the circuit. After 76, a brand new circuit was built and the Formula 1 cars returned in 85, but it didn't prove popular and the German Grand Prix is now established at Hockenheim. The only problem for the old circuit is that it's too popular, and on public days there can be a dangerous mix of slow and fast drivers, not to mention motorcyclists who kill themselves at the rate of roughly 1 a week. But for this festival in April, the organiser Jerry Maroney had laid on proper marshalling and promised his guests fast and slow sessions. He was rewarded with a diverse array of vehicles, but the star of the show was undoubtedly Neil Corner's Mercedes.
Well, it's a 1938-39 W154 that was raced by the team when they won most of the Grand Prix in those years. It was mainly von Brauch's car. I took 10 years to restore it. It was the most painful experience of my life, financially and time-wise, to restore the car. But it's very original, apart from part of the body panels. After the war, it went to Czechoslovakia. The Germans stored it in an aircraft factory. Then it was liberated and went to America, where it did Indianapolis 3 times. The engine stayed in America, the car came back to England, and after a lot of trouble, I managed to get the engine and put the car and the engine together again. And I just thought it had to come to this grown-up man's circuit, you know, and give it a run round.
Well, shouldn't it be in cotton wool in a museum somewhere?
Yeah, but cars, you know, they've got souls, and mechanical objects, if you just put them away and never use them, they don't like it. They've got to be used. And I think half the joy of having something like this is taking it out, And at least if you're not racing it, the younger people can see what it's like. Can you imagine at Donington in 1938 with 5 of these and 5 auto unions going round there together? It must have been like the men from Mars.
To follow the Mercedes on its first historic laps of the Nurburgring for 55 years, we hitched a lift with Willie Green in his replica C-Type. It turned out to be quite an exciting ride.
Well, it's been the best excuse ever to follow a Mercedes like this round the Nurburgring, which is such an incredibly nostalgic occasion. I mean, I just can't believe it's happened. Neil was excited as well. It's one of his first laps in the Mercedes, and he went a bit too quickly, but we tried to keep up.
And you're working quite hard to keep up.
Couldn't have worked much harder. It's almost on the limit.
It develops 500 horsepower. It's got skinny tyres. You drive it on the accelerator, really. You just use the steering wheel to get it into a corner, and then the accelerator does everything else. And on this circuit, it's absolutely magic. And the suspension is so soft. Rudy Uhlenhau, the designer, was the first man to discover soft springing on a racing car. It's like sitting in an armchair. It's far more comfortable than a 250F. And down this straight here, I've got it undergeared. I mean, I've only got it geared for 160. It will put 185 down there easily.
But this C-Type, it's not a real Jaguar. This is a Proteus?
It's a toy which I built myself from a Proteus kit, and I figured it would be quite good fun here. And compared to some of the other cars, it is, shall we say, disposable.
But it's nevertheless good fun to drive.
It's fantastic fun. I love it. It's very fast, and it's good, economical fun.
Now, I'd like to race it, but seriously, the engine's very complicated. It's a V12, 48 valves, everything's roller bearings. The car's got nothing to prove by winning any historic race. It did all it had to do in 1939.
There was no doubting the racing pedigree of another of Neil Corner's cars returning to old haunts. And on this occasion, I was able to try it out.
Well, it's perhaps not surprising that we couldn't get Neil to let me out in his Mercedes, but his son Nigel has let me do a few laps of the new Grand Prix circuit in his glorious 250F Maserati, of the very type that Fangio used to win the German Grand Prix in '57.
The 250F is one of the classic Grand Prix cars of all time. Run by the works and also available to privateers, it was a popular choice on Grand Prix grids from 54 to 58, producing around 270 horsepower from its straight-six 2.5-litre engine.
The thing about a car of this vintage is you have to double the clutch down through the gearbox. None of this easy gear change. Turn in gently and feed the power gently because there's not much grip.
There may not be much grip, but the balance is classic. Sterling Moss established himself on the Grand Prix scene in a 250F and described it as a lovely car to drive as it steered beautifully and was inclined towards stable oversteer.
Now this actual car is the very car that Juan Manuel Fangio used to win the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix. And the thought of driving this around the streets of Monaco makes the mind boggle.
Of course, with such little grip, Fangio didn't have to suffer the horrendous G-forces of the modern Grand Prix projectiles. But the heat from the engine in front was exhausting enough, and the Grand Prix lasted over 3 hours. Back to the clinical modern Nurburgring, and I'd found the 250F a delight on the smooth surface. But Moss reported that it would use up all its available suspension travel over the bumps of the old circuit. So how did Nigel find it some 40 years later?
Fantastic. I don't think there's anything you can do in a motor car, actually, which would be better than what I've just done. Attacking that circuit on a day like this, in this car, great.
But what is the appeal of this car to you?
I think it's, if you're a bit of a romantic, I think the history of it, I mean, you're sitting in a car that Fangio sat in and indeed won a Grand Prix in, and you're driving at a circuit that was built for this sort of car. And circuits do get the cars that they deserve, I think, to a large degree, and the old Nürburgring and this were made for each other.
It's easy to see why Sterling Moss called the 250F Maserati one of the most beautiful of all classic Grand Prix cars. But it was a sports car that gave Sterling one of his most famous victories at the ring, the 1959 1,000 kilometres in an Aston Martin DBR1. In an epic recovery, he took over 2 minutes off the opposition after his co-driver Jack Fairman had been forced into a ditch by a slower car. It was the 3rd success in a row for the nimble Aston. 2 years previously, Noel Cunningham-Reid had won.
I was sharing with what I think was the best driver in the world at the time, which was Tony Brooks. He went out and he did the first third of the race, and he gave me a lead of 3 minutes, and I was told I mustn't go faster than 10-minute laps. But I didn't have to race, all I had to do was keep it on the track.
That in itself is no mean feat for anyone, especially if you're unfamiliar with the layout.
I didn't know the circuit, that was the trouble. I'd only had 16 laps of practice and only 2 of them in the race car. But things were a little disorganized in those days. You didn't sort of practice that much.
But it's the length and diversity of the Nurburgring that makes it a favourite track for drivers like Willie Green. He first raced there 25 years ago in a GT40.
The circuit has changed a great deal since then, but it is still the only racing track in the world. I mean, everywhere else relates to a go-kart track by comparison.
So you've driven a lot of laps here then, but you know the way round now?
No. I know lots of it, but there are some bits that look very, very similar, that would have different endings, as it were, and if you find you're in the wrong one, it's your ending.
This Nurburgring festival is almost at its end. The grandstands are empty, but they've been like that all the time. And that's the whole point of this event. It's not about spectating, it's about the joy of driving motor cars.